Ancient initiates did not mark their preparation calendars on the day of a rare astronomical threshold. They marked it 3 days before, because what the tradition understood about threshold crossings and what the modern astrological calendar consistently leaves out is that the preparation window is not the runway before the event. It is the event itself. You are watching this video with 3 days remaining before the rarest planetary shift in 165 years. And if the tradition that mapped this transition for centuries is accurate about how these windows work, you did not arrive here 3 days out by coincidence. What comes next is the framework that was preserved specifically for this kind of timing. Do not scroll past it. The astrological coverage of Neptune entering Aries has been focused almost entirely on April 4th, the date the planetary ingress completes, the moment the shift registers in the ephemeris. That focus makes sense from a tracking perspective, but it misses what the ancient practitioners considered the most operationally significant portion of any major threshold crossing. In Egyptian astronomical practice, in the Pythagorean school at Croton, and in the texts that later formed the foundation of Hermetic philosophy, the 3 days preceding a major celestial event were not treated as led-up. They were treated as the initiation itself. The event was the destination. The preparation window was the door. And the door, in every one of these traditions, was 3 days wide. Consider the specific moment you are occupying as you watch this. Not 10 days before April 4th, not 2, 3 days out. If you have encountered the Hermetic principle that the timing of when information finds you is not random, that the timing is itself part of the information, then apply that principle right now. You are watching this with exactly the interval the ancient initiation tradition considered the minimum functional preparation window. That is the specific interval every tradition we are about to examine, identified as the period where intentional preparation produces a qualitatively different outcome than passive observation alone. You have 3 days. That is enough. But only if you understand what each day is actually asking for. If this kind of depth, the kind that was preserved through mystery schools and transmitted across centuries, is what you are here for, subscribe to this channel before we go further. This is where we continue building on this work together, one threshold at a time. Here is the inversion that most coverage of this transit will not reach. The shift the Hermetic tradition is pointing toward did not begin April 4th. It began the moment the 3-day window opened. You are already inside it. The preparation period is not before the event. It is the first phase of the event, the phase where the incoming frequency is present enough to be felt and worked with, but has not yet locked into its new configuration. Once the threshold closes on April 4th, the field settles into a pattern that will hold for the next 14 years. What can be aligned intentionally right now will not be available in the same way once the ingress completes. This is not urgency as a marketing tactic. It is a structural description of how these windows function according to the tradition that mapped them. What the 3-day window represents energetically is a period of maximum sensitivity in the field. When a planetary body of Neptune's orbital weight, a body that takes 165 years to return to the same position, crosses a major threshold in the zodiac, the transition does not happen all at once on one morning. It happens across a window where the frequencies of 2 very different energetic signatures overlap. The outgoing Pisces signature and the incoming Aries signature are both present simultaneously. That overlap creates conditions that the ancient practitioners recognized as unusually workable, a moment where the internal state of the practitioner can be brought into alignment with the incoming pattern before the incoming pattern solidifies. That window is now. You are standing inside it. Think about the hours immediately before a large storm system arrives over land. The barometric pressure shifts measurably 12 to 36 hours before the visible weather changes. Animals respond to that pressure shift long before any human instrument would flag the change. Ancient navigators learned to read those hours specifically because they represented the last window in which a ship could be moved to a more protected position before the pattern locked. The 3-day window before a major celestial threshold operates on the same principle. The field has changed, the shift is incoming, and the practitioner who understands this has a brief, concentrated period to work with the transition rather than simply be moved by it. Every significant astronomical tradition that survived long enough to produce a written record shows the same structural understanding. Major celestial thresholds are not single-day events, and the days immediately preceding the crossing are not passive waiting. The Egyptian temple system built preparation rituals into the 3 days before solstices, before the heliacal rising of Sirius, before any event the priests considered a field-level transition. The Pythagorean school at Croton required 3 days of specific practice before any initiate was permitted to cross into active study. These were not coincidental similarities between traditions that developed independently across centuries. They were convergent mappings of the same energetic reality, and what comes next is why the number 3 specifically, not 2, not 4. But first, if what we have covered so far is landing with you as more than astrological background, write in the comments right now. Today's date, then, I prepared before the peak, not as a spiritual declaration, as a timestamp. You are inside the window. Record that you are here. The most documented example of a 3-day preparation window functioning as a threshold crossing map appears in a text that predates the Hermetic corpus by centuries. The Book of Jonah. In that narrative, Jonah spends 3 days and 3 nights inside what the text describes as a great fish, a period that precedes his emergence into his actual mission. The miraculous element of the story has received the majority of interpretive attention across 2 millennia. But the practitioners of the ancient mystery schools were reading something specific in the structure of that account that the mainstream interpretation consistently bypassed. They were reading the timing. 3 days of complete internal dissolution before emergence into a new context. 3 days of removal from the previous frame of reference before the new assignment becomes possible. What the esoteric tradition preserved about the Jonah account is not a commentary on the miracle. It is a structural observation about the mechanics of threshold crossing. The practitioner who enters a major transition without a preparation period does not cross a threshold. They are carried across one. There is a difference. Being carried across means you arrive in the new context, still organized around the old one, still thinking in the framework of what was, still responding to the new frequency from a position calibrated to the previous configuration. The 3 days inside the fish are not incidental to the story. They are the preparation, the dissolution of one orientation and the beginning of another, conducted over exactly 3 days. The popular reading of the Jonas account focuses on the power behind the miracle. The esoteric reading focuses on why 3 days specifically. Why not 2? Why not 1 week? And the answer the mystery schools preserved is structural. 3 days is the minimum period for the internal field of a practitioner to reorganize around a new frequency. Less than that, and the old pattern rebounds. More than that, and the window of maximum energetic availability passes before the preparation completes. 3 days is not a symbolic preference. It is a calibrated interval, and the traditions that mapped it, from the ancient Near East to the Pythagorean schools of ancient Greece, arrived at the same calibration independently. The same 3-day structure appears in the early Christian accounts of the resurrection, specifically in the interval between the crucifixion and the emergence on the 3rd day. The mystery school reading of that narrative, which is distinct from the theological interpretation, focuses not on the metaphysics of resurrection, but on the timing as a map. 3 days between the complete dissolution of one form of existence and the emergence into a qualitatively different mode. This reading is not an attempt to reduce a sacred text to a self-help framework. It is an acknowledgement that the traditions that produced and preserved these narratives understood threshold crossings according to principles that repeated across contexts. The 3-day window is not an accident of storytelling. It is a structural feature of how deep transitions work. What becomes striking when you examine these accounts together, the Jonas narrative, the Pythagorean initiation structure, the early Christian resurrection tradition, is that none of these traditions had direct contact with each other during the periods when these structures were being established. They were mapping the same territory from different vantage points and arriving at the same measurement, something that happens in 3 days, not in 1, not in a week. 3. When independent traditions without contact converge on the same specific interval, the mystery school reading is that they were each mapping a real property of the field, not inventing a symbolic preference. And the property they were all mapping is the same one we are inside right now, 3 days before April 4th. If this content is opening something for you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this at the right moment. The Pythagorean practice at Croton is worth examining specifically because it is one of the most structurally documented examples of the 3-day preparation window applied to a non-mythological context. Before a student at the Pythagorean school could cross the threshold from observer to initiate, from someone who studied the principles to someone who actively practiced with them, they were required to spend 3 days in a specific preparation sequence. The structure was not arbitrary, and Pythagoras was not working from a symbolic preference for the number 3. His school understood the number mathematically. 3 is the first configuration that produces a field rather than a line. 1 is a point, 2 is a polarity, a relationship between 2 points. 3 is the first arrangement that creates an enclosed space, a field, an area. And the internal field of a practitioner requires 3 days to reorganize around a new frequency for the same geometric reason. Why 3 and not 2? The ancient answer, preserved through the Pythagorean tradition and echoed in numerological systems from the Kabbalistic to the Vedic, is structural rather than symbolic. 1 represents the singular, the undivided. 2 introduces opposition, a polarity that defines each pole by its contrast with the other. 3 introduces resolution of that polarity into a third position that transcends both. In Pythagorean mathematics, 3 is where the abstract becomes actual, where the potential becomes a configuration that can contain something. The 3-day preparation window operates on this principle. 2 days is a polarity, a back and forth. 3 days creates the field that makes a genuine threshold crossing, rather than a pendulum swing, possible. The 3-day interval is not the most convenient preparation window. It is not the easiest or the most comfortable. It is the minimum functional window for a specific kind of internal reorganization. The Hermetic tradition, following the Pythagorean understanding, was precise about this distinction. 3 is not chosen because it is mystically significant. It is significant because it is the minimum, less than 3 days, and the new pattern has no internal space to land in. The practitioner who arrives at a major threshold with less than 3 days of preparation arrives there still occupied by the previous configuration. The window you are in right now, 3 days before Neptune completes its ingress into Aries, is exactly the minimum viable preparation window for the 165-year cycle that is beginning. Most of the astrological analysis of Neptune entering Aries has focused on what the transit will bring, the dissolution of old collective structures, the ignition of new individualistic currents, the generational reshaping of how humanity relates to identity, to boundaries, to what Aries initiates and Neptune dissolves. All of that analysis is relevant, but it addresses the transit as something that will happen to the collective. What the mystery school tradition preserved, and what has not circulated in the mainstream coverage, is the personal operational layer, the specific framework available to an individual practitioner in the 3 days before such a threshold, and what can be done with those days that cannot be done as effectively at any other point in the 165-year cycle. If you have been applying the principles from this channel, working with frequency, with the Hermetic laws, with the understanding that the inner state produces the outer pattern, and you have felt that something is on the verge of movement without quite breaking through, the specific window you are in right now is what the tradition would point to. I have left something in the first pinned comment for those who are ready to move through the threshold with specific structured support. It is there for the practitioner who is done with observation and ready to apply the framework with precision. The Kybalian's fifth Hermetic principle, the law of rhythm, describes how every cyclic transition carries a pre-threshold period where the energy of the incoming swing is concentrated and workable. The measure of the swing in one direction determines the measure of the swing in the other, and the moment just before a major directional change carries the full potential energy of the entire arc. The specific language the Kybalion uses is that the swing of the pendulum is felt at the extremes, and the moment just before reversal is when the practitioner who understands the mechanic can work with the concentrated energy of the transition rather than simply being swung by it. Neptune's entry into Aries is not a pendulum swing of days or years. It is a swing of 165 years. The energy concentrated at this threshold is correspondingly larger than any ordinary transition the Hermetic practitioner would encounter in a lifetime. Egyptian astronomical priests operated with a formal understanding of pre-threshold windows that modern scholarship has documented through the records of temple astronomical practice. In the calendar system, built around the Nile's agricultural cycle and the heliacal rising of Sirius, which Egyptian cosmology treated as the most significant annual celestial event, the 3 days before a major threshold were treated as a distinct temporal category. They had different ritual requirements, different food protocols, different states of awareness required of the priests responsible for navigating the transition. This was not superstition or custom. It was the accumulated practical knowledge of a tradition that had been mapping celestial transitions for longer than any other surviving civilization. And what they mapped consistently was this. The quality of the field in the 3 days before a major threshold is different from both what precedes and what follows. It is more workable, more responsive, more concentrated, and it asks for 3 specific things from the practitioner who wants to use it rather than simply pass through it. Here is the structure that emerges from these converging traditions. Egyptian, Pythagorean, Hermetic, 3 days, each with a different energetic quality, each quality requiring a different practice, each practice preparing the ground for the next. Day 1 carries the quality of examination, Day 2 carries the quality of reception, Day 3 carries the quality of declaration. These are not arbitrary assignments. They correspond to the 3-part structure of any genuine threshold crossing. First, create space by examining what no longer belongs in the next cycle. Second, receive what the incoming frequency is delivering. Third, declare, in the internal language of position, not of wish, where you are entering the new cycle from. The protocol drawn from multiple ancient sources is specific, not ceremonial, operational. Day 1 does not begin with intention setting. It does not begin with visualization of what you want to attract. It does not begin with gratitude journaling or affirmation practice. Those are useful practices for steady-state maintenance. Day 1 of a preparation window is different in kind, not just degree. It begins with examination. Specifically, the examination of what has been held together by effort rather than alignment, the structures in your life, your relationships, your internal narratives, your assumptions about what is available to you, that are being maintained through force of habit or obligation rather than genuine correspondence with the direction you are moving. Day 1 asks you to see clearly what is ready to dissolve, because Neptune in Aries will dissolve it either way. The question is whether you arrive at that dissolution as a participant or as someone it happens to. The initiate entering the first day of the preparation window at the Pythagorean school was not given a list of goals to set or outcomes to visualize. They were given 3 questions. What have I been holding on to that has already completed its function? What am I maintaining out of obligation rather than alignment? Where have I been the obstacle to my own movement? These are not comfortable questions. They are clarifying ones. And clarity about what is actually holding the previous configuration in place is precisely what Day 1 is designed to produce. Not resolution, not action, not intention, naming. Because naming is the first form of release in every tradition that examined how dissolution actually functions. You do not have to solve what you name on Day 1. You have to see it clearly enough to name it. The inversion that Day 1 requires is this. The preparation window is not the moment to build. It is the moment to create the space that building requires. This distinction seems obvious when stated plainly, but it is consistently inverted in the way modern practitioners approach threshold events. The default impulse, when you become aware of a major transition, whether it is a significant personal event or, in this case, a 165-year planetary ingress, is to focus on what you want to create in the new context. That focus is not wrong. It is premature on Day 1. Neptune in Aries begins its work by dissolving what Pisces had organized. The practitioner who begins Day 1 by adding new intentions to a field that has not yet been examined is adding to a space that has not been cleared. The examination comes first. In the Pythagorean initiation at Croton, the first evening of the preparation period was spent in complete silence. Not meditation on desired outcomes, not recitation of goals, silence and inventory. The philosophical tradition behind that practice understood something the modern self-improvement framework consistently understates. You cannot accurately assess what you are building toward until you have assessed what you are still carrying from the previous cycle. The teachers of the school put it practically. They understood that a student who enters initiation, still occupied by the assumptions and obligations of their previous life, does not actually cross the threshold. They carry the old life with them under a new label. Day 1's practice interrupts that carrying. It asks what is actually ready to be released, and it does so before the new cycle offers its invitation. What is it that you have been maintaining past its natural completion? That is the question Day 1 of this window is designed to answer. Not what you wish were different, what you have been actively keeping in place through effort, through the repetition of familiar patterns, through the management of dynamics that have already finished their functional purpose in your life. The answer to that question is not always comfortable, but it is always clarifying. And the clarity it produces creates the only kind of space that the incoming frequency of Neptune in Aries can actually land in. Not the space of wishful emptiness, but the space of honest examination. That is the specific quality of Day 1. Tonight, if you are watching this on April 1st, that practice begins now. What actually happens when you sit with the questions of Day 1 is worth naming clearly. The internal experience of examination, the discomfort, the recognition, the moments of reluctance before clarity arrives, is not a painful process when approached with the detachment the Hermetic tradition describes as necessary for any diagnostic practice. The practitioner who examines is not condemning what they find. They are noting it. The distinction between judgment and examination is the distinction between a reaction and an assessment. Judgment produces defensiveness, which contracts the internal field. Examination produces clarity, which expands it. Some of what you find during day one will be immediately obvious, things you have been aware of but have not yet allowed to be named as complete. Some will be subtler, both belong in the same inventory. There is also something that the first night of a preparation window consistently delivers in the accounts the tradition preserved. A quality of unusual clarity in the hours after the examination practice. Something settles, not because the unresolved has been resolved, but because it has been named. The naming releases a specific quality of mental energy that has been occupied by maintenance, by keeping what is unspoken suspended, by holding what is incomplete in a kind of permanent provisional state. When you name what is ready to dissolve, you stop allocating energy to the pretense that it is something other than what it is. What the Hermetic tradition would describe as frequency that becomes available again, released through honest naming, is part of what the second day then receives into. The clearing of day one and the reception of day two are not separate operations. They are the first two movements of a single process. The space created by day one's examination, that is the ground that day two moves into. And day two is a different kind of practice entirely. Day two does not ask you to examine, it asks you to receive. The distinction is foundational to how the preparation window functions. Day one created space by naming what was ready to dissolve. Day two requires something that the examining mind, if left unchecked, will resist. The practice of opening to what is arriving rather than what you have decided you want to arrive. These are not always the same thing. Neptune in Aries is not a vending machine for your preferences. It is a 165-year field transition that delivers what the next cycle actually requires. And what the next cycle requires is not always identifiable from inside the frame of reference you currently occupy. Day two's practice is the practice of allowing the incoming information to arrive without immediately filtering it through the existing framework. The initiate on day two of the Pythagorean preparation window was given a specific instruction. Pay attention to what comes to you without your solicitation, dreams that arrive with unusual clarity, thoughts that appear at unexpected moments. Conversations that find you rather than the other way around, impulses whose origin you cannot trace to a deliberate decision. In the Hermetic tradition, these unsolicited arrivals during the preparation window carry a specific quality of information. They represent the field communicating with the practitioner rather than the practitioner communicating with the field. Most of the time, that direction of communication is reversed. We send intentions outward, we ask questions, we visualize and declare. Day two inverts the channel. It is the day of listening, not speaking. In Egyptian temple practice, the middle day of any 3-day preparation sequence was designated the day of maximum communication. Not from the priests to the cosmic field, but from the cosmic field to those positioned to receive it. The Nile priests who managed the agricultural calendar understood that the flood's timing, the soil's quality, the harvest potential were not things the priests decided. They were things the field communicated, and the priest's role was to be positioned to receive that communication accurately enough to act on it with precision. The day two practice was built around that orientation. Stop generating and receive. Stop declaring and listen. Stop adding and allow what is arriving to arrive without your interference modifying it before it has been fully received. What does reception actually look like in practice, particularly for a practitioner who is not embedded in a mystery school tradition with teachers and structure? The traditions that have been examined here converge on one concrete prescription: keep a record. Write down everything that arrives unsolicited on day 2. Do not interpret it on day 2. Do not analyze whether it is significant or coincidental, real or imagined, important or irrelevant. Write it down and hold it. The interpretation and the action belong to day 3. Interpretation on day 2 distorts the signal before you have received it fully. The discipline of holding what arrives without immediately processing it through your existing framework is itself the practice of day 2. It strengthens the capacity to receive without immediately converting incoming information into confirmation of what you already believed. The quality of attention that day 2 requires is genuinely different from the directed focus most practitioners are trained to develop. Day 2 is not a practice of heightened vigilance. It is a practice of relaxed availability. The difference is subtle but operationally significant. Heightened vigilance looks for specific things and tends to filter out what does not match the expectation. Relaxed availability, the state the Egyptian temple practitioners were cultivating during the middle day of any preparation window, creates a field of presence in which the unexpected can arrive without being screened out before it is received. This requires allowing actual periods of quiet. Not meditative emptiness as a goal, but genuine pauses in the ordinary stream of directed mental activity. In those pauses, the incoming frequency of the threshold has space to communicate. The record you keep during day 2 is not a journal of interpretations. It is a transcript of arrivals. Here is what day 2 inverts, and why that inversion matters. In most spiritual and manifestation practice, the practitioner's job is to send a clear signal outward. Set the intention, raise the frequency, declare the desired outcome, hold it in the field. That is appropriate for steady-state work. The preparation window operates differently. When you are approaching a major threshold, particularly one of the magnitude of Neptune's 165-year ingress, the informational flow needs to be received before it can be responded to effectively. Day 2 is the practice of positioning yourself as a receiver rather than a transmitter. The examination of day 1 cleared the field. Day 2 lets the field speak into that cleared space. What you receive during those hours, before April 4th, may be the most practically useful information you access in the entire 14-year Neptune in Aries transit. You have almost certainly noticed something in the quality of your inner experience over the last 3 or 4 days, a different texture to certain thoughts, dreams that were unusually vivid or unusually specific, a sense of something forming just beyond the edge of what you can quite articulate. Perhaps a pull toward certain questions, or an unusual clarity about something you had been uncertain about. Day 2's practice says this directly. That quality of experience is the field communicating, not metaphorically, not as a spiritual reassurance, as a description of what is happening when a 165-year frequency transition is 3 days from its completion, and you are a sensitive practitioner inside the window. Write it down, all of it, without editing or evaluating. Day 3 will use it. Day 1 examined. Day 2 received. Day 3 declares. Day 3 carries the quality of declaration, and of all 3 practices, it is the most precisely misunderstood. Declaration, in the Hermetic operational sense, is not affirmation. It is not positive thinking, and it is not the repetition of desired outcomes in the present tense as if they have already occurred. Declaration, as the ancient initiates practiced it, is the act of stating clearly, internally or in writing, the position from which you are entering the new cycle. Not what you want, not what you hope will happen, not even what you believe will unfold. The specific, honest declaration of what you are prepared to engage in the next cycle. The distinction is between wishing and positioning. Wishing looks outward toward a desired outcome. Positioning looks inward at the actual state of the practitioner and names honestly where that state is prepared to go. The initiate completing the third day of preparation at Croton was required to do something neither of the first 2 days demanded: speak. Not in prayer, not in petition, not in asking for something from an external source. The Pythagorean tradition understood declaration as a form of frequency alignment, the moment where the internal field of the practitioner, having been examined and opened over 2 days, makes deliberate contact with the incoming frequency by naming its own readiness. This is the act the third day carries. You have examined what is ready to dissolve. You have received what is arriving. Now you name where you are standing as you cross the threshold. That naming is not performative. It is operational. It changes the quality of your relationship to everything that follows. The Corpus Hermeticum, the Greek-Egyptian texts compiled in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE that form the documentary foundation of the Hermetic tradition, contains a description of the relationship between internal naming and external manifestation that is relevant here. The Hermetic texts describe the mind that has clearly named its position as having already begun its work, a phrase that has been widely quoted but is rarely unpacked in the context of how the preparation window actually functions. The naming is not the beginning of a magical process. It is the moment where the internal state of the practitioner and the incoming external field first make genuine contact. Before that naming, the practitioner is a point in a field. After it, they are a point with a specific orientation relative to the field. And that orientation determines the quality of every subsequent encounter with the field during the transit. What is the practical difference between declaring what I want and declaring what I am prepared for? The difference is the entire operational gap between aspiration and initiation. Wanting is a state of orientation towards something not yet present. Being prepared is a state of internal readiness that exists in the present. When you declare what you want, you are describing a future state that you hope the field will produce. When you declare what you are prepared for, you are describing the current state of your internal field, where it has been cleared to, what it has received, what it is genuinely ready to engage. The second declaration is the one that creates actual correspondence with the incoming frequency, because it is accurate. An accurate description of your current internal state aligns with the field you are actually in. A declaration of desired outcomes that doesn't correspond to your current internal state creates a gap, and the law of correspondence operates across that gap in a direction you cannot control. The declaration practice of day 3 is more effective when it is specific rather than general. The tradition did not preserve this as a prescription for vague aspirational statements. What the Hermetic understanding of declaration requires is naming a specific domain, a specific orientation you have been developing, a specific area that day 1's examination cleared, a specific piece of information that day 2 delivered, and stating precisely where that domain stands as you cross the threshold. Not where you wish it were, where it actually is, given the clearing that day 1 produced and the information day 2 brought. That specificity is what creates the correspondence the law of correspondence describes. A general statement of openness does not create a specific alignment. A precise declaration of actual position does. And here is the paradox: the initiate who has completed day 1's examination and day 2's reception encounters on day 3, the honest declaration of where you actually stand is often less dramatic and considerably more precise than what you might have declared before the preparation window. The unprepared declaration tends towards scope. I am entering complete transformation. The prepared declaration tends toward accuracy. I am entering this cycle having released a specific set of obligations that were held together by habit rather than alignment. Having received information about a direction I had been considering for months without full clarity and positioned to engage that direction with a quality of commitment that the previous configuration made impossible. That second declaration is less exciting to read. It is the only one that creates genuine correspondence. The field does not respond to enthusiasm. It responds to precision. Day 3 is the most counterintuitive of the 3 practices for this specific reason. Instead of formulating what you want to attract or manifest, you are examining whether your actual internal state corresponds with what you are claiming to want. The law of correspondence, that the Hermetic tradition identified as the second of the 7 principles, operates in one direction. The inner state produces the outer pattern, not the other way around. Day 3's preparation practice is the act of closing the gap between what you are claiming and what you are actually positioned for. Not by pretending the gap doesn't exist, but by honestly naming what you are genuinely prepared to engage and making that the declaration. Because that honest declaration is the only one that actually corresponds with the field. And correspondence is what the Hermetic tradition, from beginning to end, identifies as the functional mechanism of manifestation. April 4 arrives either way. Neptune in Aries completes its ingress without requiring your awareness, your preparation, or your participation. The shift is not conditional on anything you do or do not do in these 3 days. What is conditional, what does depend on the 3 days, is the quality of your relationship to what unfolds across the 14 years of this transit. Whether you navigate it as someone who understood what was happening at the threshold, or as someone who experienced the effects without having accessed the framework that would have allowed for intentional positioning. The shift happens. The question has never been whether the shift happens. It has always been the question the ancient traditions asked: where are you standing when it does? The people who navigated the last Neptune in Aries transit, the period from 1861 to 1875, with clarity and purpose, were not the ones who predicted which specific events would occur. They were not the prophets or the soothsayers. They were the ones who understood the quality of the time they were living through, who recognized that the dissolution underway was not catastrophe. It was the removal of structures that had outlived their function, and that what was being cleared was clearing for something. The abolitionists who had been working for decades found in that transit the energetic support that made their work decisive. The social thinkers whose ideas had seemed marginal suddenly found those ideas becoming central. They did not succeed because they were lucky. They succeeded because they were aligned with what the frequency of the time was actually doing, rather than what the previous consensus said should be happening. Picture 2 people arriving at April 4th. The first has encountered the information that something rare is happening astrologically, but has not engaged the preparation framework. They arrive at the threshold interested but unprepared, carrying the full weight of the previous configuration, their internal field still organized around the patterns of what was. The second has used the 3 days, has named what is ready to dissolve, has opened to receive what the incoming frequency is delivering, has declared honestly where they are standing and what they are prepared to engage. The first person crosses the threshold, the second person initiates. Both will experience the next 14 years of Neptune in Aries. The quality of those experiences will not be identical. You did not find this video 10 days out, not a month before, not the day of. You found it with 3 days remaining, with exactly the amount of time the ancient initiation tradition identified as the functional preparation window. The Hermetic framework for why this timing matters is not a comfort. It is a precise description of a real property of how information functions within the field. You are positioned to receive this because you arrived at a moment when it was possible to act on it. That is not coincidence in the casual sense. It is correspondence in the hermetic sense. The information arrived when the receiver had the specific interval required to do something with it. You have 3 days. The framework is now in your hands. The shift unfolding is not arriving to remove something from you. It is arriving to dissolve what you have been holding in place, what has been maintained beyond its natural completion, what has been carried forward past the point where it was serving the direction you are actually moving. That is Neptune's historical function, documented across every transit of this planet through every sign in the zodiac since systematic observation began. The dissolution is not punishment, and it is not loss. It is the specific clearing that makes the next phase possible. The practitioner who knows this, who walks into April 4th, having spent 3 days examining what is ready to dissolve, receiving what is arriving, and declaring the position from which they are entering, does not experience the dissolution as something happening to them. They experience it as something they are participating in. That is a different relationship to the same event. Ancient mystery schools understood rare astronomical thresholds precisely as generational initiations, not as unusual external events, but as moments in which the field of collective experience reorganized around a new frequency in a way that created a specific opportunity for individual practitioners to move with the reorganization rather than simply be reorganized. The 3-day window before such a threshold was not a ceremonial formality. It was considered the initiation itself. The crossing of the planetary threshold on April 4th is the confirmation. The 3 days before it, examination, reception, declaration, are where the actual work of initiation happens. And that work is available right now, specifically to the practitioner who found this framework in time to use it. Something specific brought you to this video at this moment, not to a general overview of Neptune in Aries. There are dozens of those. To this one, with its specific focus on the preparation window, with 3 days remaining. The Hermetic tradition's understanding of why certain information arrives at certain moments is precise. The field directs information toward receivers who are positioned to act on it within the relevant window. You are positioned. The framework is specific. The window is open. April 4 will register for most people who are even aware of it as a date on an astrological calendar, a marker of an event that passed, a planetary ingress that happened as predicted. For the practitioner who used these 3 days, who examined on day 1, received on day 2 and declared on day 3, it will mark something different. It will mark the beginning of 14 years of intentional navigation within a 165-year cycle, not 14 years of waiting for something to happen. 14 years of moving with what is unfolding at the level of the collective field, with the understanding of what Neptune in Aries is doing and why, and the internal positioning that makes the difference between being moved by a field and navigating within one. 3 days, the rarest window in 165 years, and you found it in time to prepare. That is not nothing. That is precisely the kind of timing the Hermetic tradition identified as meaningful, not as reassurance, but as information. The shift does not require your preparation to proceed. Neptune in Aries is not contingent on any individual practitioner's readiness, but the quality of what you access within the transit over the next 14 years is contingent on where you were standing when the threshold closed. The practitioner who arrives at April 4th, having used the 3-day window, enters the transit already in motion, already organized around the incoming frequency, already positioned with the direction of the shift rather than perpendicular to it. The one who arrives without preparation is not excluded. They are simply starting from a different position. And position, in the Hermetic understanding of how cyclic transitions work, is not a minor variable. Each of the 3 days carries its own specific quality. Tonight, day 1, carries the quality of examination. Tomorrow, day 2, carries the quality of reception. The day before the threshold, day 3, carries the quality of declaration. These are not arbitrary categories. They are calibrated to the internal process that the ancient traditions identified as the functional sequence for genuine threshold crossing. Examination creates space. Reception populates that space with incoming information. Declaration establishes your position within the new configuration. 3 days, 3 operations, 1 threshold. The framework has been mapped. The window is open. Tonight, the practice begins. The 14 years of Neptune in Aries that begin with this ingress will not be uniform in quality. Every major planetary transit has its own internal structure, periods of maximum intensity, periods of relative integration, thresholds within the larger threshold. But the practitioner who enters the transit, having completed the preparation window, has a specific navigational advantage that cannot be acquired by entering unprepared and learning from experience alone. They enter with a relationship to the transit established at its most concentrated point of energetic availability. What was named on day 1, received on day 2, and declared on day 3, creates a correspondence baseline, an internal orientation to the incoming frequency, that then forms the ground from which every subsequent encounter with the transit's themes will be navigated. The preparation window is not a one-time event with a one-time result. It is the establishment of a foundation. Between the closing of this 3-day window and the end of the Neptune in Aries transit, which astrologers currently map to approximately 2038, the practitioner who engaged the preparation framework will encounter the same pattern: examination, reception, declaration, recurring at smaller scales in different domains, with different content but recognizable structure. What the Hermetic tradition understood about cyclic transitions is that the large cycle creates a template that the smaller cycles within it recapitulate. What you practice now, in the most concentrated form available, you will encounter again, subtler, faster, but structured the same way. The practitioner who knows the structure from having moved through it at full scale is not surprised by its smaller iterations. They recognize them. And recognition is the beginning of navigation. If you stayed until the end of this video, write in the comments, today's date then, I chose the window, not as spiritual performance, as a record. You were here 3 days out and you prepared. I have placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.